Hello YouTube. In this video I'm going to examine philosophical criticism of science, what we might call philosophical anti-science. The topic here is philosophical perspectives that involve negative attitudes towards science. Now before we get into this, I just want to do a brief little advert. You can support my channel through Patreon or donate on PayPal. I also offer private tutoring in philosophy. Send me an email for details on that. Okay, let's get started. So, first of all, what exactly is philosophical anti-science? It's worth distinguishing philosophical anti-science from the way that the term anti-science is used colloquially. So, very often the term anti-science will be used to refer to views which involve a rejection of the current scientific consensus. For example, those who support intelligent design and creationism, or those who deny anthropogenic climate change. This is not what is meant by anti-science in this video. Usually you find that people who defend these fringe views do not criticize science as such. They're not, or at least they do not claim to be, critical of science. In fact, usually they will claim that they are the ones who exemplify the relevant scientific virtues. So somebody who denies anthropogenic climate change will usually support their position by claiming that the empirical evidence does not support anthropogenic climate change. They will claim that there is something wrong with contemporary scientific institutions, some sort of bias or whatever that has led to them evaluate the evidence incorrectly. So this is not what we're talking about. The topic here is rejection of science or a negative attitude towards science itself. Similarly, there are many philosophers who are critical of current science because they object to particular types of particular research practices, for example. So think about the literature on the replication crisis, how the replication crisis might be caused by things like publication bias, data dredging, inappropriate statistical analysis, the publish or perish culture of academia, or consider feminist critics of science who argue that much contemporary science evinces an androcentric bias. You can see my video on feminist philosophy of science for more on that topic. So again, although these people are critical of current science, they are not anti-science. Most people who work in these fields are strongly supportive of science. They have identified problems in current scientific research, and their goal is to improve science. Obviously, a lot of the people who work on the replication crisis, for instance, are scientists. The anti-scientific stance sees science as fundamentally misconceived. It sees science as fundamentally broken in a way that cannot be reformed. Now, there's relatively little literature in contemporary philosophy of science that evinces a kind of anti-scientific stance. In this video, I'm going to briefly describe some anti-scientific perspectives, but an initial statement of a kind of anti-science position is given by Wittgenstein in his book Culture and Value. So Wittgenstein says, I quote, "It isn't absurd to believe that the age of science and technology is the beginning of the end for humanity, that the idea of great progress is a delusion, along with the idea that the truth will ultimately be known, that there is nothing good or desirable about scientific knowledge, and that mankind in seeking it is falling into a trap. It is by no means obvious that this is not how things are." So clearly Wittgenstein is not suggesting that scientists should replace a currently accepted scientific theory with an alternative scientific theory. He's also not suggesting that we should improve science by more carefully scrutinizing research methods. He is expressing a pessimistic assessment of science in itself. He's striking at the heart of science. Unfortunately, Wittgenstein doesn't really elaborate on this suggestion, but it's a useful initial statement of a kind of anti-scientific perspective. So I suppose the central question here is, what is it that's supposed to be so great about science? you know, like so most people working in philosophy of science at least generally think that science is a really great thing. But like, why is that? What's supposed to be so good about science? Like, what is the anti-scientist, the anti-scientific stance up against? Well, I mean, broadly speaking, I think there are two ways in which science is often thought to be privileged. First, science is commonly thought to have a kind of epistemic success. So, science is our best tool for understanding the facts about the natural world. Science gives us knowledge, understanding, true belief about how things are. It tells us the way the world really is, the way it really works. Now, skepticism of epistemic success is common enough in philosophy. There are plenty of skeptical arguments which undermine the view that science uncovers the truth about reality. Empiricists, pragmatists, many philosophical traditions have, in one way or another, been skeptical of these epistemic claims. Indeed, a sort of anti-realism about scientific theories is common enough among scientists themselves. So I have a whole series on the realism, anti-realism debate in philosophy of science. But I think it's fair to say that, there's lots of people who will deny epistemic success, but who still have a very positive attitude towards science. They still see science as a very useful tool. So this suggests the second way in which science is supposed to be privileged, which is that science is distinguished by its practical success. Science has given us an unprecedented degree of control over the world. It allows us to identify and solve problems in a way that no other tradition can. It cures diseases. It increases crop yields. It builds televisions. It sends rockets to Mars. Or at least it allows us to do all these things. Basically, science is the only tradition that really delivers the goods in terms of solving practical problems. So, even people who are anti-realists about scientific knowledge tend to accept that science is remarkably successful at solving practical problems. We can debate whether the practical success of science allows us to infer that scientific theories provide true descriptions of the world, but the presupposition that tends to go unquestioned is that science exhibits this remarkable practical success. And so I think this is the main point that any anti-science perspective will have to contend with. It is the incredible practical utility of science. I mean, this just seems obvious. It seems undeniable. So I think the Wittgenstein quote suggests an initial objection to this claim of practical utility, because we might argue that actually in many respects the impact of science has been disastrous. Look at problems like climate change, pollution, microplastics, resource depletion, the destructive power of nuclear weapons, social problems like the harvesting of data to manipulate populations via directed advertisements on social media, the increasing social isolation and breakdown of community ties that is found in urbanization. All of these things, all of these problems are a product of technological development. So this is perhaps the kind of thing that Wittgenstein was hinting at when he was saying that science could be the beginning of the end for humanity. Science has enabled a high consumption, highly specialized, problem-solving civilization, but this in itself has had destructive consequences. I mean, some of these consequences are very serious as well. Now, I think there's an interesting asymmetry in how we talk about the kind of positive and negative aspects or positive and negative consequences of technology. Generally speaking, science gets the credit for the positive applications of science. So cancer treatments, for instance, right? We have the ability now to cure cancer. Science gets the credit for that, but it doesn't so often get the blame for the negative consequences like climate change and potential nuclear war. In fact, there's a funny thing that happens where science may actually get the credit for the negative consequences. So with respect to climate change, we might say, well, look, it's science that allows us to identify that climate change is occurring and to develop solutions to it. So climate change, which was itself caused by scientific and technological development, at least partially by that, becomes yet another example of the success of science, because science allows us to identify climate change and science allows us to come up with potential solutions. But even so, there's this interesting asymmetry, right? So the positive applications count as success, but the negative consequences, not so much, right? So one view here is that, well, look, both the positive and the negative applications of technology reflect positively on science, because in both of these cases, we are increasing our control over the natural world. And increasing control can be applied to both good and bad causes. So we can use our greater powers to cure cancer or to produce more food for the poor, or we can use our greater powers to build nuclear weapons. But it's science that gives us these powers. Science is a tool, and any tool can be used for good or bad ends. I might use a gun to defend myself from an attacker or to commit a mass shooting. Either way, if the gun is killing people, it is successfully functioning as a gun, right? Like a gun that kills people is an effective gun, and you can use a gun for good ends or bad ends. So similarly, the fact that science has these negative consequences, that doesn't really reflect badly on science. In fact, that reflects positively on it. Science allows bad people to achieve their goals, just as it allows good people to do that. So the claim is that science enables us to achieve our goals. It allows us to increase our control over the world. If you want to perform some particular task, science will probably help enable you to do it. So in response to this, we might argue that this overlooks that the applications of technology have all kinds of unforeseen consequences. And we kind of noted this already, I guess, with the point about climate change, right? Like many of the problems that we use science and technology to solve have themselves been caused by science and technology, and they're unexpectedly as well. They've been an unexpected effect of science and technology. The people who initially exploited fossil fuels in producing the combustion engine didn't foresee ocean acidification and greater hurricane intensity. Very often science will be applied to solve some problem only for this solution to create greater problems in the future. The first manufactured plastic, Parkesine, was invented in 1855, partly in response to the scarcity of animal-derived materials. So elephants had nearly been driven to extinction by the ivory trade. Parkesine was a cheap substitute for ivory, and it was used for simple household items like combs. Now, these early pioneers of plastic, they didn't foresee the explosion in the plastics industry or the effect of plastic pollution and the accumulation of microplastics in the environment. Indeed, we still don't know the effects of this. We still don't actually know what the effects of microplastics are going to be. It looks like the effects aren't positive. It looks like it could be quite bad. But we still are actually unsure about this. So, there was this problem of resource depletion. Science was applied to solve the problem, but then new problems were created by that solution. So with this point in mind, it's not at all clear that we can just say, oh, well, science allows us to achieve our goals, or it gives us greater power to execute our goals. Certainly science allows us to achieve some of our goals, but then it may well frustrate other goals. Perhaps it may frustrate more important goals and in unexpected ways. Now, there are various problems then that have come about as a result of science and technology. Some of these problems are serious enough that they may potentially threaten the survival of civilization. Perhaps with further scientific research we will be able to solve these problems, but then perhaps not. At this point it seems premature to be confident either way. So, we might think, okay, look, the assumption underlying the idea that science exhibits great practical success is that in the end, science will solve these problems without creating any catastrophic new ones. But what basis is there for this other than just faith, right? We might have faith that the process of science will eventually solve all of the major problems, including the major problems that science itself has had a role in creating. But I mean, what we actually have, the data so far just shows us, okay, we have this process of scientific, technological, historical development and change, and problems get solved, new problems emerge. Some of these problems may well be catastrophic. Maybe they're going to get solved, maybe not. That is our current position. So we can take that leap of faith and think that science will eventually solve these problems, but it's not clear that there's any. It's not clear what sort of rational argument there would be for that. So obviously one kind of anti-science perspective then is the more pessimistic assessment here, is to say, actually science has had a number of disastrous consequences, and there's really no reason to expect that these problems that it's created will be solved in the future. Now, a second response to the claim that science, to the claim of practical success, is to question whether science should receive the credit or the blame, as the case may be, for these technological developments. So I guess generally, we usually take it that the success of a technology counts as an achievement of the sciences associated with that technology. So we have this sort of naive picture of technological development that looks something like this. First of all, scientists confront some practical problem. Maybe a material that's used as light bulb filament is becoming increasingly scarce. Second, scientists formulate hypotheses concerning a solution to that problem. Maybe they develop models for other ways of producing light, or models for other types of material that could serve as filament. These models are then tested according to scientific methods, and then on the basis of well-tested explanatory models, we can construct new technologies. So basically, you start out with a theory about how the world works, and then on the basis of that theory, you figure out how to build new instruments and do new things. This picture is very questionable, though. In many cases, technological development is a result of tinkering in the dark. It's a result of trial and error, and then after new technologies are developed, theoretical models may be proposed to account for those technologies. So there are many cases where theory is downstream, as it were, from technological development. The technology results from people who don't really know what they're doing, just tinkering, and it's not the result of explanatory testable theories. A good example of this is provided by Harry Collins in his book Changing Order. Collins describes the construction of the transversely excited atmospheric laser, or the TEA laser. So after the first operation of a TEA laser by a laboratory in 1968, several other laboratories attempted to construct their own version of this instrument. Now, the theory underlying the instrument was well known, and scientists attempting to build the TEA laser had a straightforward model of how the instrument worked. So here's a circuit diagram of the TEA laser. Now, you might think that if you have this model and you have some knowledge of engineering and you have the relevant materials and enough funding, then you yourself will be able to build a TEA laser. You can just, follow the instructions. Collins found, however, that of 6 laboratories which were trying to construct a TEA laser, not a single one succeeded, using only information found in written sources. Building a TEA laser required extensive contact with somebody else who had already built one before. And all of those people who were attempting to build the laser would run into unforeseen problems. Very often the solution to those problems were the product of just trial and error. Collins describes how making the electrodes was an insuperable problem for one laboratory. One laboratory just gave up. But then he says, I quote, another British laboratory had produced the shapes of the electrodes roughly from templates and a filing operation, while an American laboratory had simply used lengths of aluminium banister rail, both with complete success. And in both cases, it was unclear exactly why these ways of making the electrodes actually worked, right? That scientists themselves weren't really sure, just why particular solutions to things worked. Similarly, Collins describes the attempt of one scientist, Bob Harrison, to solve a particular problem with his instrument. So when Harrison was trying to construct his laser, he ran into the problems that at high voltages it would produce enormous sparks among the electrical components. Now, in Harrison's machine, this electrical arcing was occurring between earth points and other earth points that should have been at 0 voltage, and it was occurring between components that were separated by much more than the recommended distance. Collins quotes Harrison, "You wave hands at that point because it's a subject that's been going on 100 years and it's still pretty difficult to understand, except under controlled physical conditions where, say, you have two flat surfaces and a point. Remember when we had that really enormous breakdown that was from a high tension lead to Earth, and that just didn't make sense rationally because there was a bloody foot separating them?" In the end, Harrison simply had to insulate various components of the machine with polyethylene sheets. And this was a product of trial and error. So particular components would unexpectedly arc, then he would insulate them. And of course, he got lucky. He got lucky that this insulation did not unexpectedly prevent other parts of the machine, like it didn't unexpectedly interfere with the functioning of other parts of the machine. So it just turned out that like he stumbled upon a solution which solved the problem without creating any more problems. As Collins summarizes, even those who succeeded in building a laser and making it work did not fully understand it. So in this situation, a TEA laser had actually already been constructed by one laboratory, and there was an accurate theoretical model of how the laser functioned. Even so, for many laboratories, it still took months of work and contact with previous laser builders to build their own lasers. So, as Collins sees it, laser construction is a skill that involves a kind of tacit knowledge. Building a laser is not something that you can learn from just understanding a theoretical model. In the same way, you can learn a great deal of physics about, balancing bikes, but still not be able to ride a bike. Now, of course, once an instrument has been successfully constructed a number of times, we may develop tools for mass producing the instrument. Today, actually, TEA lasers are quite easy to build. And we may develop more sophisticated models of the functioning of the instrument. Scientists who have worked extensively in the field and so who have gained a great deal of tacit knowledge may attribute their ability to construct the instrument to knowledge of the theoretical model rather than to their tacit knowledge. And so this creates the impression that the theory is responsible for the practical success of building the instrument. But actually, theory is kind of epiphenomenal, right? Like you have this practical ability, this practical skill that comes through tinkering, through trial and error, maybe through sort of understanding like similar previous experiences that you've had with building other instruments of a similar kind, and then you construct a theory, and then like once you have a functioning instrument, then you construct a theory of it. Of course, in practice, in many cases, technology, theory, historical accident form a sort of interconnected web. There are no doubt many technologies that have been enabled by the development of theories, but it's unclear how to assign the credit for many technologies. So the point is that in a world without anything resembling modern science, there might still be relatively sophisticated technologies, but it's not. So yeah, the point is it's just not clear that science gets the credit that like the development of explanatory theories that are tested according to scientific methods, it's not clear that that should get the credit for the sort of practical engineering success. These are two traditions that are, to some degree, independent, although, of course, they very closely interact. So this is one way we might undermine claims that science is privileged because of its practical success. So let's turn to another concern about science, maybe a deeper concern about science. And this relates to the degree of specialization that's involved in science. So consider how science develops, right? Science aims to provide explanations for natural phenomena. But once one explanation is provided, this simply raises further questions. Explanations never come to an end. You might explain, I don't know, the motion. You might explain the tides. Let's say you explain the tides by citing the gravitational influence of the moon on the Earth. Well, okay, but now that just raises the question of how the hell does gravity work? So, and this is just like, this is how science works, right? Like you provide an explanation for one thing, but there will be some aspects of that explanation that require further explanation. Similarly, science aims to solve problems, but once one problem is solved, you're just going to have other problems to deal with. It's not the case that you solve every problem. There will always be more to explain. There will always be more problems to solve. So science works by developing increasingly detailed theories, and of course it values novelty, right? So scientists will try to extend the work of previous scientists by trying to find new problems, new approaches to those problems, new experiments, new observations, new ideas. And moreover, as science develops, there is increasing systematization of knowledge. Scientists try to find new links between different fields. And of course, there is increasingly sophisticated forms of technology. So as Wittgenstein says, in science and technology we see, and I quote, onwards movement and building ever larger and more complicated structures. So, okay, I mean, that seems fair enough. But the result of this process is that knowledge and control is taken out of the hands of individuals. It is impossible for any particular individual to perform even a fraction of 1% of all the experiments that support the contemporary scientific worldview. I mean, just think about what would be required for you yourself, to perform the experiments that we take to support, say, the expansion of the universe. Like, what would you actually have to do? What experiments would you actually have to perform yourself in order to show to yourself that hypothesis is adequately supported by the evidence? Not even professional scientists are personally able to verify even a fraction of their worldview. Moreover, it is impossible for any individual to properly understand the functioning of even 1% of the technologies that have an influence on their lives. So knowledge and understanding is today invested not in any individual, but in this kind of massively complex social institution. And we might worry that this has the effect of undermining democracy and undermining individual liberty, because the result of this is that we are forced to offload cognitive labor onto experts, right? We are forced to trust experts. So almost all aspects of our lives become governed by the judgments of experts. All technologies are developed, maintained, improved by experts in those technologies. These different fields have become so specialized, it requires extensive training to understand and evaluate any given technology, or at least many of the technologies that power our society. It's so, like, an individual, just as an individual, I'm in a position where, like, I just can't make an informed assessment of the theories that underlie any given technology. I can't make an informed decision about how that technology kind of functions, how it should be used, what its effects might be. Like, I just can't do that. It's far beyond my capacities. So the most that can be said is this: I must trust the science. I must trust the experts. And there is, I think, something, you can see there's something a little bit troubling about that. I mean, we might see a kind of conflict here between science and these other values that might matter to us, like democracy, like allowing all individuals to, or at least encouraging all individuals to, give their input and make their own decisions. I mean, the problem. So I suppose the issue with sort of science and technology is that these technologies have incredible power, right? This is claimed to be one of the virtues of science. It's given us this incredible control. So we have technologies that have this enormous power, and yet it is beyond the capacity of the vast majority of citizens in a society to understand and evaluate those technologies. They have to just trust the experts. That's it. Trust the experts. And that's, again, there's something perhaps a bit troubling about that. And it's hard to see as well how we could reform science to avoid this problem. I mean, if scientists stopped pursuing increasingly sophisticated explanations or increasingly sophisticated explanatory hypotheses, it's not clear that we would have anything like science left. This is this is another worry. Then is potential tension between science and other values, and perhaps democratic values. Okay, let's turn to a final anti-science perspective, and I'm going to be drawing here on Daoist philosophy. So the thing to notice then is that the development of science and technology presupposes particular values. It presupposes a particular conception of what makes life go well, of what projects are worth pursuing. The basic case for science, as we've seen, is that it allows us to increase our control over the world. It has this incredible practical success. Now, there are ways of challenging that assumption, but we might actually go further and say, well, why should we suppose that increasing control over the world is a good thing? It's not just obvious that solving problems and having more control is the best way of making our lives go well. So an interesting sort of alternative view is provided by the Daoist philosophy of the book Dao Desire. Actually, I don't know if I'm pronouncing the name of that book correctly, so I could be just getting that completely wrong. I should also note I'm not an expert on Daoism. I'm drawing here on the article Well-Being and Daoism by Justin Tiwald. So it may well be that Daoism is not necessarily as resistant to scientific progress as I'm about to suggest. The point here is not really to introduce Daoism, but to just present a perspective from which the practices and products of science are actively harmful. So Tiwald summarizes the Daoist ideal of the good life, and I quote, as a life relatively free of attachments and deeply in tune with spontaneous, unself-conscious dispositions and inclinations. Similarly, he writes that, and I quote, a certain kind of unself-consciousness is a major component of well-being, most famously as a form of non-action or effortless action or non-purposive action. Okay, so let's see how this works in a bit more detail. Basically, the Dao Desire describes a kind of ideal society. So it presents a sort of vision of an ideal society, which is basically a kind of primitive agrarian utopia. So it tells us to, I quote, reduce the size of the state, lessen the population, make sure that even though there are labour-saving tools, they are never used. Make sure that people look on death as a weighty matter and never move to distant places. Make their food savoury, their clothes fine, their houses comfortable. Make them find happiness in ordinary customs. So in the primitive utopia, people use only low-tech, simple tools. Society is organised into decentralised, independent village communities. People find satisfaction in ordinary customs, so in eating simple foods, in exercising, in forming friendships, in playing games, card games, football, whatever. But simple games, and so on. And people rarely communicate with different communities. They rarely leave their own community. Their primary concern is subsistence, right? They aim to build shelter, grow food, access water, right? That's the goal. Their goal is not military glory or material acquisition. Moreover, the Tao Te Ching recommends that society should be illiterate. It should be ignorant of any knowledge that is not directly relevant to the practical concerns of subsistence living. So, okay, why should we take this seriously? Why would we think that this is a utopia? Well, the primitive utopia is derived from the Taoist account of desire. So according to the Tao Te Ching, there are two types of desire. There are natural desires that arise spontaneously from within the human organism. For example, hunger. Human beings need to eat to survive, and as a result, we experience the desire for food. And this desire is just something that it just comes from within us, regardless of who we are, what we do, what sort of society we're in. This is just shared universally by all humans. Even a hermit completely isolated from society will still seek out food. Second, there are acquired desires that arise due to the influence of external things. For example, the desire to own a flashy new iPhone. So maybe I see all of my friends purchase a new iPhone, and as a result, I develop the desire for a new iPhone. Now, as the Tao Te Ching sees it, natural desires serve one's needs, while acquired desires make one a servant of external things. The pursuit of acquired desires is detrimental to well-being, and it tends to lead to personal frustration and interpersonal conflict. It's worth noting there's not a strict distinction between natural and acquired desires. Some desires may be partially acquired. Consider that hunger can be satisfied either by eating bread or eating rice. If I have a strong preference for bread because I've been raised in a society with particular culinary tastes, that will count as an acquired desire. Because the natural hunger can be satisfied by either bread or rice. Acquired desire makes us, it's the acquired desire that makes me focus on just one of these. Okay, so what's wrong with acquired desire? Well, first of all, acquired desires are limitless. Once I buy the flashy new iPhone, I'm not going to be satisfied with that. Maybe I'll have a little bit of pleasure for a little bit of time, but it's not going to last. I'm pretty soon I'm going to seek out some other new thing. I'm going to find myself frustrated. I'm going to want something new, a flashy new television. And then when I buy the flashy new television, again I get a little bit of pleasure, but then I'm just going to set my sights on some other new object. I'm just going to restlessly, strive for more and more and more. There's no natural ending point, because no matter how many items I possess, I can always possess more. No matter how many novel experiences I undergo, I can always undergo more. So there's no point at which the drive for external things rests. There's no point where I reach satisfaction. I will constantly be comparing my current state with an imagined better state where I have more things or access to a greater range of experiences. And contrast this with natural desires. When I experience hunger and I eat food, well, that's the end of it. I've satisfied my hunger, at least until obviously the body it will require food again at some other point. But with the pursuit of natural desires kind of have this just end point where it's like, okay, you're hungry, and then you resolve the hunger. So provided that I've fulfilled the basic needs that keep the body functioning, I'm going to be satisfied. A second issue with acquired desires is that the person who develops so when you pursue acquired desires, you develop increasingly sophisticated and increasingly refined tastes. You become a connoisseur. And the trouble with the connoisseur is that the connoisseur is insensitive to ordinary pleasures. So once I've developed the acquired desire for really specific food items, the simple pleasure of satisfying my hunger is no longer enough. I'm no longer going to get pleasure from that. If I develop a taste for some really special cheese and garlic sour bread, I'm going to lose the ability to appreciate simpler foods which once brought me enough satisfaction just by satiating hunger. So like for somebody who has not been captured by acquired desires, the pursuit of natural desires brings enormous pleasures. That it is in itself incredibly rich and rewarding, and we become blind to those pleasures when we pursue acquired desires. As the Dao De Jing puts it, the 5 colours blind our eyes, the 5 notes deafen our ears, the 5 flavours deaden our palates, the chase and the hunt madden our hearts. So acquired desires deaden us to simple pleasures. They make us restlessly pursue ever greater accumulation of resources and experiences without ever finding satisfaction. We're constantly frustrated because, in principle, acquired desires have no limit. Acquired desires do not bring us any lasting well-being. Finally, given the scarcity of resources and given that acquired desires are limitless, pursuit of acquired desires will lead to inequalities. It will create social instability. People will envy those who have more than them. And some people will be deprived even of basic necessities so that others can indulge in refined desires. It's once you move away from the sort of simple subsistence lifestyle, you start to see the accumulation of resources in the hands of just part of the society, perhaps in the hands of just a very few, and then they can sort of use that to control and exploit the rest of the population. So in the sort of agrarian, in the primitive utopia, where people focus just on satisfaction of natural desires and they're ignorant of the world beyond their simple lives, it's possible for everybody's desires to be met. Now, so this is a point of view from which science and technology are in principle misguided. The claim is that science is so great because it allows us to increase our control over the world. But what this means is just that science gives us the capacity to fulfill our acquired desires. And as the Dao De Jing sees it, that actually is going to reduce well-being. In fact, it's somewhat misleading from the point of view of the Dao De Jing to view satisfaction of acquired desire as involving greater control, because when I pursue the desire for a faster car or a bigger house or a flashy new iPhone, actually I've deadened myself to simple pleasures and made myself a servant of technology. The kind of control that science gives us is not a kind of control worth wanting. And the knowledge that science gives us, science will give us knowledge of the world, but I mean, what use is this knowledge in itself? The knowledge of the world only makes us develop acquired desires. It doesn't bring us happiness. Second, notice that science, in many ways, is an exemplar of exactly this kind of treadmill of acquired desire that the Dao De Jing warns against. The pursuit of acquired desires is almost built into the structure of science. So, as we've seen, science proceeds by searching for explanations and solving problems. But explanations and problems never come to an end. Every scientific explanation is fundamentally unsatisfying because there's always more to explain. So, I explain the tides by citing gravitational forces exerted by the moon on the Earth, and then that just raises the further question of what is gravity? And then, I investigate that, and I just raise more and more and more questions. And I mean, this is actually crucial to scientific progress. Many people would probably see this as actually a good thing. But so think about this. So from the point of view of the Dao De Jing, the scientist is caught in this trap of restlessly, relentlessly pursuing a desire for knowledge. She's committed to constructing theories of ever greater complexity with no end in sight, with no lasting satisfaction, and it doesn't. What does it do? What does it achieve in itself? In fact, even if you did somehow produce a theory of everything that just explained everything and had no gaps and kind of satisfied our desire for explanation, what good would that be? If you had some theory where no further explanation was required, no further problems arose. Okay, so so what? Why is that a good thing? In fact, of course, we never have that because it's just this constant, restless pursuit of more and more explanations, and the kind of simple pleasures of life are sacrificed in that pursuit. What better example of a person captured by acquired desire than the scientist? So yeah, I mean, this is a very different sort of perspective on well-being, on what makes life go well, and it's a perspective from which science is viewed very negatively. And that's all there is to talk about today. That is the end of that video. I hope you found that interesting. Thank you for watching.